The razor-sharp edge of a flint knife pressed against Samuel Thorne's throat, held by a hand so small it seemed impossible. He was woken not by a sound, but by the cold certainty of his own death. Before him was a whirlwind of furious buckskin and black hair. An Apache girl, no older than 12, her eyes burning with a fire that could melt steel. It wasn't fear he felt, but a profound shock. His fortress of solitude had been breached by a phantom. How did his life come to this? If you are curious what happens next like me, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss a thing. It all began 24 hours ago with a silence so absolute it had become Samuel Thorne's only companion. For 8 years, since the fire, his world had shrunk to the boundaries of his remote Montana ranch, a rugged patch of earth carved into the feet of the mountains. He was a man living in the past tense, his days a repeating ritual designed to keep memory at bay. He would mend fences that didn't need mending and track cattle that were never lost, all to fill the void left by the laughter of his wife, Clara, and the breathless questions of his son, Daniel. The fire had taken them in a roaring, merciless blaze, leaving Samuel with nothing but the searing guilt of survival. He had built this new life, this fortress of solitude, not as a sanctuary, but as a self-imposed penance. He was a jailer and a prisoner in a prison of his own making, and the silence was his warden. His ranch was nestled in a valley the settlers called Whispering Gorge, a place of breathtaking beauty and brutal indifference. The town of Providence, a day's ride away, was a place Samuel avoided at all costs. It was a town choking on its own fear, a fear directed squarely at the Apache, whose hunting grounds they had usurped. The town's fear was orchestrated by a wealthy land baron named Bartholomew Kane, a man with a politician's smile and a vulture's ambition, who kept the settlers united in their hatred, a unity that conveniently expanded his own influence and property lines. Samuel felt nothing but contempt for their loud, performative prejudice. He knew what true terror felt like. It wasn't the shadow of a warrior on a ridge, but the smell of smoke and the sudden, final silence of a home that had once been filled with love. His refusal to join their chorus of fear made him an outcast, a man whose quiet grief was mistaken for cold arrogance. The day had started like any other. Samuel was riding the fence line along the northern edge of his property, where a small, clear spring bubbled up from the earth. It was his wife's favorite spot. As he dismounted to check the water level, a glint of color in the mud caught his eye. He knelt, pushing aside a clod of wet earth, and uncovered a small, child-sized moccasin. It was exquisitely made, adorned with a single line of vibrant blue beads, but it was soaked through and looked as if it had been lost in a frantic scramble. It was Apache. For 8 years, his land had been inviolate, a sterile bubble sealed off from the world. Now, this small object was a profound intrusion, a footprint from another world left in the heart of his sanctuary. He felt a jolt, not of fear, but of a deep, unsettling disruption. He buried the moccasin again, wanting to erase its existence, but he could not erase the feeling that a boundary had been crossed. As the day wore on, the feeling of being watched intensified. His cattle were skittish, their lowing edged with a nervous energy. The wind, usually a familiar whisper, now seemed to carry voices he couldn't quite make out. More than once, he caught a flicker of movement high on the ridges surrounding his valley, a fleeting shadow that was there one moment and gone the next. He tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a coyote, his own frayed nerves. But the feeling persisted, a cold prickle on the back of his neck that told him he was no longer alone. As dusk settled, blanketing the valley in a deep, purple shroud, he retreated to his cabin. He barred the door, a ritual he hadn't performed in years. The silence inside was no longer peaceful. It was charged, heavy, and listening. Something had changed. The world he had worked so hard to keep out was now pressing in, and he had a terrifying premonition that it was about to break down his door. Sleep offered no sanctuary. The image of the small, beaded moccasin was seared into Samuel's mind, a symbol of the world's intrusion. Long before dawn, driven by a restlessness he couldn't name, he found himself walking toward the spring, a lantern cutting a weak, trembling circle in the oppressive dark. He heard it before he saw it, a soft, guttural sound, the sound of pain being fiercely suppressed. There, near the spot where he'd found the moccasin, lay its owner. She was a crumpled heap of buckskin and black hair, wedged between two large rocks. A recent rock slide, small but vicious, had trapped her leg, twisting it at an unnatural angle. She was conscious, barely. As his lantern light fell across her face, her eyes snapped open. They were wild, dark, and filled with a defiant fire that seemed to mock the weakness of her body. Seeing him, she didn't cry out. She issued a low hiss, like a cornered lynx, her small hand reaching for a flint knife that lay just beyond her grasp. Every instinct for self-preservation that Samuel had cultivated over 8 years screamed at him to retreat. This was not his concern. She was a lit fuse, and his entire life was a powder keg. To help her was to invite the very chaos he had fled. The town of Providence, whipped into a frenzy by Bartholomew Kane, would see this as the ultimate betrayal. They would call him a traitor, an Indian lover, and use it as the perfect excuse to seize his land, the one thing he had left. The Apache, if they found him with her, would likely see him not as a savior, but as a captor, the cause of her injuries. He was a single man against two worlds that wanted nothing more than to see him crushed. He could turn around right now, walk back to his cabin, and by morning, the wilderness would have solved his problem for him. It was the sensible choice. It was survival. His quiet, lonely peace depended on him turning his back. But he couldn't move. His boots felt nailed to the ground. He looked at her, at the raw determination etched onto her face, the way she gritted her teeth against a pain that would make a grown man scream. He saw the faint blue beads on her remaining moccasin, a small, beautiful detail in a world of profound ugliness. And in the fierce, untamed fire of her eyes, he saw not an enemy, but a reflection of a spirit he thought had been extinguished in himself forever. He saw his own son, Daniel, who had faced the smoke and flames with a bravery that had shamed Samuel's own terror. The phantom limb of his fatherhood, an ache he felt every single day, throbbed with a sudden, unbearable intensity. For 8 years, he had been a ghost, a passive observer of his own empty life, powerless to change the past. But he was not powerless now. To walk away would be to let the last ember of his humanity die, to become as cold and empty as the men in town he so despised. The decision was not a conscious thought, but a tectonic shift in the landscape of his soul. He would not, could not, leave her. He knew touching her would be a violation, an act of aggression in her terrified world. So he did something else. He set the lantern down on a flat rock, giving her light. Then he turned his back on her, an act of profound trust and vulnerability, and walked briskly to his cabin. The girl watched, her defiant hiss catching in her throat, replaced by a stunned silence. He returned minutes later, not with a rope, but with his thickest wool blanket, a full canteen of fresh water, and a strip of dried venison. He placed these items on the ground, just outside her reach, but well within the circle of light. It was a silent offering, a message sent across the chasm of their two worlds. I will not harm you. I am here to help. The choice is yours. Then, he retreated to the shadows at the edge of the clearing to stand vigil, a solitary guardian choosing to face the storm he knew was coming. If you think Samuel made the right choice, to risk everything for a stranger, please like this video to spread the kindness. He watched as she battled her own instincts. For what felt like an eternity, she remained motionless, her eyes, two burning coals in the darkness, darting from the offering to his shadowy figure and back again. The primal fear of a predator was at war with the desperate needs of her broken body. Finally, with a pained, guttural groan, she surrendered. She reached a trembling hand and dragged the canteen toward her, drinking in deep, desperate gulps. Then she devoured the venison with a hunger so raw it was painful for Samuel to witness. She did not touch the blanket. Instead, as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, she fell into an exhausted, feverish sleep, her small hand never straying far from the hilt of her flint knife. Samuel did not move from his post. He stood guard, a silent, unmoving statue, as the sun rose, revealing the full, brutal extent of her injury. Her leg was not just trapped, it was broken, the bone jutting at an angle that made his stomach churn. She would not be leaving this place on her own. The sound of hoofbeats sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. It was a pair of riders, coming from the direction of Providence. Samuel instinctively moved to shield the sleeping girl from view, his body a solid wall between her and the approaching danger. He recognized them immediately. It was Bartholomew Kane himself, accompanied by his hired enforcer, a hulking man named Jonas whose only skill was brute force. Kane reined in his horse, a smug, proprietary smile on his face as he surveyed Samuel's land. "Thorne," he said, his voice dripping with false cordiality, "I was just admiring your valley. A man could build a dynasty here. It seems a waste for it to be occupied by just one lonely soul." The threat was barely veiled. Kane's ambition was an open secret. He wanted every acre of this valley, and Samuel's ranch was the prize jewel. "This land is not for sale, Kane," Samuel said, his voice flat and cold. Kane's eyes narrowed, his smile tightening. "Everything is for sale, Thorne. It's just a matter of finding the right price, or the right motivation." His gaze swept past Samuel, a flicker of interest in the unusual formation of rocks by the spring. "Losing cattle lately? We've had reports of Apache raiding parties in the area. A man alone, it's a dangerous world. It would be a shame if something unfortunate were to happen to you out here." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Kane was not just making a threat. He was laying the groundwork for a narrative, a story he could sell to the town if Samuel were to suddenly disappear. He was planting the seeds of fear, a crop he was an expert at cultivating. Samuel felt a cold dread creep up his spine. This was no longer just about land. He was caught in a much larger, more dangerous game, and he had just willingly taken possession of the one piece that could cause him to lose everything. As Kane and Jonas finally rode off, their parting glances filled with menace, Samuel knew he was running out of time. The girl, still lost in a feverish sleep, was a ticking clock. He could not leave her here to die, but moving her would be an immense risk. He was torn between his newfound, fierce responsibility for her and the terrifying, real threat posed by Kane. The town, fueled by Kane's whispers, would believe any lie he spun. They would see Samuel's compassion as collusion, his secrecy as guilt. Every choice before him was fraught with peril. He could try to get a message to the Apache, but how? He didn't know their language, their trails, or if they would see his message as a trap. He could try to confront Kane, but that would be suicide. As he looked down at the girl, her face contorted in a pained slumber, he felt a wave of helpless gratitude that she was unconscious, spared from the knowledge of the new danger that now circled them like vultures. The fever took hold as the sun reached its zenith. The girl began to thrash, her groans of pain replaced by delirious, guttural whispers in a language he did not understand. Her skin was hot to the touch, and her breathing grew shallow. Samuel knew if he didn't act, she would die. The fear of Kane, the town, the Apache, it all became secondary to the immediate, desperate need to save this one life. With a surgeon's care, he used his knife to cut away the rock and earth trapping her leg, the sound of grating stone a harsh counterpoint to her ragged breathing. The break was severe. He had to set it. It would be an agony for her, and a profound violation. "Forgive me," he whispered, as much to himself as to her unconscious form. He gripped her leg, and with a swift, brutal motion that tore at his own soul, he snapped the bone back into alignment. She screamed, a raw, piercing cry that echoed through the silent valley, a sound that he knew would haunt him for the rest of his days. Then, mercifully, she fell silent again, limp and still. He worked quickly, his hands moving with a long-forgotten muscle memory from a life before the fire, a life where he had once dreamed of being a doctor. He fashioned a splint from sturdy branches and strips of his own shirt, immobilizing the leg with a gentle precision. He carried her back to his cabin, her small body terrifyingly light in his arms. He laid her on his own bed, the one that had been cold and empty for 8 years. Seeing her there, so small and fragile against the coarse linen, a wave of emotion so powerful it buckled his knees threatened to overwhelm him. It was a phantom ache of fatherhood, a ghost of the life he had lost. He spent the rest of the day and into the night by her side, bathing her face with cool water, forcing small sips of broth between her cracked lips, a solitary, desperate vigil against the encroaching darkness of death. It was just before dawn on the second day when the riders came. But they were not from Providence. They materialized from the morning mist like spirits of the earth, a silent, formidable party of Apache warriors. They surrounded his cabin, their painted faces grim, their eyes holding a lethal promise. At their head was a man whose presence was so immense, so powerful, it seemed to suck the very air from the valley. He was older, his face a magnificent, savage mask of grief and fury. This was a chief, a leader, a man searching for something precious. Samuel felt no fear, only a profound, weary resignation. He had done all he could. The story was now out of his hands. He walked out onto his porch, unarmed, and waited. The chief dismounted and strode toward him, his hand resting on the hilt of a massive knife. "Where is she?" the chief demanded, his voice a low, rumbling earthquake. Before Samuel could answer, a weak voice called out from inside the cabin. "Father!" The chief froze, his hand tightening on his knife. The girl appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on a crude crutch Samuel had fashioned for her. Her face was pale and drawn, but the fire in her eyes burned as brightly as ever. She looked at her father, then at Samuel. "He did not harm me," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with an unshakable truth. She pointed to her splinted leg. "The mountain fell. He saved me." She then recounted the story, the rock slide, the offering of food and water, the agonizing setting of her bone, the vigil he had kept. As she spoke, the fury in her father's eyes began to recede, replaced by a dawning, stunned confusion. The narrative he had carried in his heart, of a brutal kidnapping, of an enemy to be slain, was crumbling before his eyes, dismantled by the simple, powerful testimony of his own daughter. He looked from his child to the quiet, weary man on the porch, and for the first time, saw not an enemy, but a mystery. If you were Samuel, what would you say or do next to solidify this fragile peace? Comment your thoughts below. The chief, whose name Samuel would later learn was Cochise, stood as if carved from stone, the entire weight of the confrontation resting on his shoulders. His warriors waited, a silent, deadly chorus, their actions tethered to his will. He looked at his daughter, whose name was Tazai, meaning the quiet one, and saw the truth in her eyes. He looked at her leg, crudely but effectively splinted, a testament to a desperate act of care. Then his gaze fell upon Samuel, a long, piercing scrutiny that seemed to peel back the layers of his soul, searching for the slightest hint of deception. Samuel did not flinch. He met the chief's gaze, his own eyes holding not fear, but the quiet, profound weariness of a man who had already lost everything once. There was nothing left to be afraid of. This quiet courage, this lack of fear in the face of certain death, seemed to unnerve the great chief more than any act of aggression could have. Samuel knew that words were almost useless here. Any plea, any explanation, would sound like the desperate bargaining of a guilty man. He needed a different language, a currency of trust that could bridge the chasm between their worlds. He slowly turned, without breaking his gaze from Cochise, and re-entered his cabin. The warriors tensed, their hands gripping their weapons, but a sharp gesture from their chief held them back. Samuel walked to the cold hearth, above which hung the only two portraits he owned. Faded, charcoal sketches of his wife, Clara, and his son, Daniel. They were his most sacred relics, the silent witnesses to his lonely existence. He took down the portrait of his son, a smiling boy with a shock of unruly hair, and walked back out onto the porch. He didn't speak. He simply held the portrait out, an offering of his own broken heart. He held the sketch next to his own face, then pointed toward Cochise and his daughter, and then placed his hand over his heart. The message, though silent, was profoundly clear. This was my child. I see my heart in your heart. I see my love for him in your love for her. What I did as a father. It was a desperate, universal plea, a statement that their shared grief and love for their children was a bond far stronger than their enmity. Cochise stared at the smiling face of the boy in the sketch, and for the first time, the hard mask of the warrior chief cracked. A flicker of something ancient and deeply human, the sorrow of a parent who understands the terror of loss, passed through his eyes. He saw not a white man, an enemy, a settler, but another father. It was Tazai who sealed the pact. She limped forward, her crutch thumping on the wooden porch, and spoke to her father in their native tongue. Her words were soft, but carried the weight of absolute conviction. She spoke of the gentleness in Samuel's hands when he set her bone, of the weariness in his eyes as he kept vigil, of the way he spoke to her as if she could understand, his voice filled with a sadness she recognized as kin to her own. When she finished, she did something that shocked everyone. She reached out her small hand and rested it for a moment on Samuel's arm. It was a gesture of profound trust, a public declaration of her faith in this strange, sad man. Cochise looked at his daughter's hand on the arm of his enemy. The final choice was his. He had come for vengeance, to burn this cabin to the ground and reclaim his daughter. But now he was faced with an unexpected request, an unspoken moral challenge, to accept an act of kindness from a man he was prepared to kill, and in doing so, to rewrite the entire history of their conflict. With a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to carry the weight of generations of conflict, Cochise raised his hand and gave a single, sharp gesture. The warriors, who had been coiled springs of lethal tension, visibly relaxed. The immediate threat of violence evaporated into the cool morning air, replaced by a stunned, uncertain silence. The chief then took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Samuel's. He did not offer a hand in friendship. The chasm was still too wide for that, but he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, a sign of respect from one powerful man to another, a concession that went against everything he had ever known. He had come here as a warrior, but he was leaving as a father who had found his daughter safe, and in the process, had found something far rarer, an enemy with honor. Cochise spoke a few quiet words to his daughter. Taz, I turned to Samuel, her dark eyes serious. He asks if you will accept a gift, she translated, her voice soft. Before Samuel could respond, one of the warriors brought forth a magnificent horse, a proud creature with a coat the color of a thundercloud. It was clearly the chief's own mount, a possession of immense value and status. Cochise gestured to the horse. This was more than a gift. It was a profound statement. In the Apache world, the giving of a horse was a gesture of deep respect, a way of sealing a pact and acknowledging a debt. To refuse it would be a grave insult. Samuel, understanding the immense significance of the act, simply nodded his acceptance. The act of giving and receiving the horse became a silent treaty, an unspoken promise of peace between the man of the lonely ranch and the people of the mountains. The warriors helped Taz onto a gentler mare, her father watching with a hawk's eye to ensure her comfort. As the party prepared to leave, a transformation began to ripple through the town below. Bartholomew Kane, assuming Samuel was already dead, had ridden into Providence with his men, proclaiming himself the hero who had driven the Apache from the valley. He was in the middle of a self-congratulatory speech in front of the saloon when Cochise and his war party appeared at the end of the street. A wave of panic swept through the crowd, but the Apache did not charge. They rode slowly, majestically, through the center of the town, their faces impassive, their gaze fixed forward. They passed the saloon, their silence a more powerful rebuke to Kane's blustering lies than any war cry could have been. The townsfolk stared, mouths agape, as the feared Apache chief led his party peacefully out of the valley, with his daughter alive and well among them. The spectacle shattered Kane's credibility in an instant. The townspeople saw not a conquering hero, but a liar and a manipulator. They looked from his blustering, red face to the quiet dignity of the departing Apache, and then toward the lone cabin in the distance, and they began to understand. They didn't know the whole story, but they knew they had been deceived. The tide of public opinion, once so firmly in Kane's favor, had turned irrevocably against him. As the last of the Apache disappeared over the ridge, Samuel stood on his porch beside the magnificent horse, a symbol of a new, uncertain peace. The walls of his solitude had been breached, but instead of destruction, an incredible, unlikely bridge had been built in its place. The world was still filled with danger, but a door had opened, and a sliver of light, warm and full of hope, was pouring into the lonely corners of his life. If you believe that a single act of courage can change the fate of an entire community, share this video. In the years that followed, the story of the lone rancher and the Apache chief became a quiet legend in the Whispering Gorge, a testament to a peace born not from a treaty, but from a moment of shared humanity. Samuel Thorne's ranch was no longer a place of isolation. It became a neutral ground, a place of quiet trade and mutual respect. He never learned the Apache tongue, and they never learned his, but they communicated in the universal language of honor and shared glances. The magnificent horse Cochise had given him became a familiar sight, a living symbol of the pact made between two fathers. Bartholomew Kane, his power broken and his reputation ruined, left the valley in disgrace, his empire of fear crumbling into dust. Samuel was never truly alone again. Though he lived in his cabin by himself, he was now part of a world far larger than his own fenced-in property. He would find gifts left for him at the spring: a brace of wild turkeys, a finely woven blanket, herbs that eased the ache in his old bones. In return, he would leave sacks of flour, tools, and sometimes a piece of hard candy on a rock for Tazai, who he would occasionally glimpse from a distance, a strong young woman now, a leader in her own right. The fire that had taken his family had left a wound that would never fully heal, but the raw, gaping void had been filled with something new, a sense of purpose and a profound, peaceful connection to the world he had once hidden from. Looking back, one can see that the fierce Apache girl did not just turn Samuel's life upside down. She turned it right side up. She broke through the walls of his grief and reminded him of a fundamental truth: a life lived only for oneself is a prison. His greatest act of courage was not facing down a chief, but opening his heart after it had been shattered. Not all who come in the night come to take. Some come to give us back the part of ourselves we thought was lost forever. If this story has touched your heart, subscribe to Mr. Storytelling, where we believe the most powerful stories are the ones that heal.